want to welcome you all today to our first session of how to create good bulletins, newsletters, and more, and all sorts of great things with desktop publishing for your church or ministry. I'm Yvonne Pren, and in this session we are going to talk about, first of all, I'm going to give you an overview of what the whole series of sessions will cover, just a real brief one. Then we're going to talk about the importance of your publications, of the job that you're doing in doing that desktop publishing, and of desktop publishing in general. So those are the things that we're going to cover in our session today. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to accomplish in the video series. In 8 half-hour sessions, you are going to learn how to plan, how to write, how to create, produce, and distribute effective church bulletins and newsletters for use in your ministry. I find that as I go around teaching desktop publishing to churches and ministries all over the country, that most people who are doing it do not have backgrounds in writing, don't have backgrounds in editing, probably haven't ever worked as a commercial artist, they probably haven't been a print buyer, they probably haven't been a publications manager, but guess what? You need to learn how to do all of those things once that computer's plopped on your desk. And they don't tell you how to do that with the machine or with the desktop publishing program. So that's where you'll find this series of sessions really helpful, because we will touch on all of these areas. Now, you can learn more from the book itself and from other things that you can read, from newsletters that are provided and that sort of thing, but in this series of classes, we'll cover all of these areas for you. Okay, first of all, I like to, in this session, I want to really establish the importance of what you're doing. I find that if you really understand why you're doing it and the impact that it can have, and in a few minutes I will talk about you yourself and the person that you are as you're doing it, it makes your whole job a whole lot easier. I know some of you are here because it is your assigned job. And it's just something that you've been doing for a long time. So I want to give you hopefully a little bit of inspiration in it. First of all, the importance of the publications that you're doing. Number one, for evangelism. Do you realize, now stop and think about it for a minute, that your church bulletin may be the only piece of Christian literature some people will ever see? Have you ever thought about that before? You know, lots of people wander into churches and they get that church bulletin, and that is the only piece of Christian literature they have ever seen in their whole life. But what happens with it? It might be the last piece that they'll ever see. Now, we don't want that to happen, do we? It's really a powerful piece, and so often, and I know I've worked in churches, and I'm doing a lot of volunteer work in my church right now. We just get to doing these things just as a routine. Oh, we got to get the bulletin out again, you know, and we forget the tremendous impact it can have on people. Also, church newsletters. Not only, I kind of tie in both evangelism and outreach. They can be a tremendously powerful tool for outreach. My husband and I are working on setting up a singles ministry at our church. And I'm very frustrated because I haven't had time to get the database together and to get some of the mailings together that I want to get together, because I know this is going to have a tremendous impact on it. Some studies were done recently by single adult ministries. This was pertaining to single people, but I think it applies to people across the board. And actually, I think the actual survey was for church people in general. They surveyed many, many people. And what was it that they found? Do you know what is people's least favorite way to be contacted by a church? It's through a personal visit. People don't like that anymore. And you know why? People are afraid. We don't want a stranger knocking on our door saying, you know, I'm from such and such a church. People don't know if that's true or not. Do you know what one of people's, as they surveyed, in conjunction with that survey, they did another survey where they asked what were some of the favorite things that people did during the day, and do you know what things scored the highest at just regular activities? It was getting the mail. We all enjoy getting the mail. Oh, is this for me? You know, did I hear from so-and-so, whatever. And also in this survey that asked how people wanted to be contacted by the church, receiving something in the mail was very high on the list. We like that. We can take it in. We can respond to it at our leisure. And it's a fantastic outreach tool. Corporate America knows this. How are so many things sold today? They're sold through targeted marketing. People ask for a catalog. Some of you who are gardeners, you're getting your spring catalogs now, all of your gardening things. Those people know you're interested in that. They send the mailing to you. And the whole area of direct mail and of creating the publications that you are creating is tremendously important in the outreach of the church today. Going door to door, as Robert Schuller did when he started the Crystal Cathedral, that doesn't work today. We have a new group, we have a new audience, we have new people, we have to have new ways to reach them. And the publications that you are creating are tremendously important. So we've talked here about direct mail versus personal visits. And 2, your outreach can expand tremendously. Now later on today, I'm going to touch briefly on the internet and online communications. But let me just say right now that everything that you learn today, all of the things that I teach you on design, on writing, on layout, on structuring your message, all of that you can apply directly to doing things online. And I tell people in my seminars, you don't realize it right now, but I guarantee that within 2 years, every single one of your churches will have a home page. And you will probably be the person maintaining it. But there is hope. All of the things that I'm teaching you now, you can apply directly to that. Another important thing about the pieces that you do is simply the communications potential of them. I had a very wrenching experience when I was, well, I won't tell you how old I was, but shall we just say in midlife when I went back to school. I went to graduate school in a community that I hadn't been into before, and always having been the sort of blessed church kid and growing up in the church and knowing everybody and everything and all the things that were going on, I didn't realize until I was out of that environment how much I took for granted. I went to these new churches, I opened up their church bulletin, and I didn't have the vaguest idea what they were talking about. I didn't know who Betty was. I didn't know that you call the Jones for whatever. I didn't know where the Smiths lived to show up for Bible study. I didn't know, all of these kinds of things that we just take for granted because, oh, everybody knows that. People don't. And my husband and I have recently moved to the Ventura area here, and going to a new church, and again, like I said, I work with churches all over the country all of the time. I have seen again and again and again where so many church programs don't get the attendance they need, and people don't show up and they don't get the response, not because people aren't interested, but because you have not communicated to them some very basic facts. We're going to talk about that later. We're going to talk about how you structure publications to help people get what they want. But so often in church, for example, in a church newsletter, what's it usually start out with? Message from the pastor. And then it'll have, he'll be talking about something, and people a lot of times don't read it. What people really want to know is, when do my kids have to be at that camp preparation program? What time? How do I get there? How long is it going to last? And those kinds of really essential things we hide away somewhere. I was looking at a church's material just recently where they were wanting to do a discipleship program. They called it something like mission or ministry preparedness. It didn't make any sense at all what they were talking about. They didn't tell you what they were going to cover. They didn't tell you how long it was going to last. They said dinner provided. They didn't tell you if it was a charge for it. And they had 3 people show up. And I thought, well, of course. People are very busy today, and they're not going to do things if we don't really tell them what's going on. So communication is extremely important, and just in every single detail. And then also for continuing ministry. Again, so many people today, they don't attend church, and I know George Barna has done many, many studies and wonderful things on this, where people do not have the same commitments to a church that they had in the past. I know particularly for people in singles ministry, it's simply a given that on any month of Sundays, you will have the same people maybe 2 out of the 4 Sundays. And the same 2 are probably not going to show up on the same Sundays or on consistent Sundays. You've got an ever-rotating group of people in and out of your congregations. Even people who consider themselves regular attenders of your church are not going to be there every Sunday. They won't hear the messages from the pulpit. They won't hear the announcements. And if you don't continue to minister to them through your publications on an ongoing basis, you're going to lose a lot of them. And so very, very important, the publications that you do. And one of the things that I want all of you to realize, I know many of you are working in church offices. And you've always got to sort of step back and realize that the people that are getting your publications didn't sit in on the 35 staff meetings that you did. By the time you get something into the publication, you're usually sick of it. Oh, yeah, you know, we're doing the Easter thing, and I know, you know, and all this kind of stuff. But people haven't heard about it for as long as you have. And so we have to constantly spell things out again and again if we want to really minister to people. Let me now, from the publications themselves, let me talk just a little bit about the real importance of your job, of just how extremely critical it is. One analogy that I always share with people is when the United States got into the Gulf War with Iran, what was the first thing that they did? Does anybody remember? They went after the communication center. And in every war, that's what an army always tries to do, is if you can knock out the communication center, you've crippled the army. And we are, as Ephesians tells us, we're involved in great spiritual warfare. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. And if you're doing communications work in your ministry, I guarantee that you are on the front lines of spiritual warfare. I can't tell you how many times I have seen where people will get computers in the church, and all of a sudden everybody starts fighting. I kind of call myself the mother confessor of the desktop publishing community. People will call me up and say, you know, I can't believe it. We're just at each other's throats, and, you know, all this stuff is going wrong, and, you know, what's happening? And I'll always say, you know, step back and see. If you can get crippled in this area, all of the things that I just told you, the importance of these publications, they're not going to get done then. And your ministry will suffer for it. And how's the enemy work on it? He's the accuser of the brethren, and he gets you fighting with each other. And I'll say, isn't that what's happening? And people always go, oh, yeah. And when those things kind of happen, you just sort of have to stop and say, you know, God is sovereign. Let's pray about this. Let's talk this through. I know that many of you are here from the same church, and that's wonderful. If you can learn some of this stuff as a team, you understand things a whole lot better. But I want you to be very aware that you are on the front lines of spiritual warfare. And that's tremendously important. And I can't tell you how many folks have either written me or emailed me or whatever, and you're all free to do that, and said, you know, I'm so glad you said that, because these things happened after I left your seminar, and I didn't understand why. And then I remembered, it isn't just a battle with this computer. There are more things at stake. And I also want to encourage you, too, on the importance of prayer. Pray about your publications. We have no idea what's going to really touch people's hearts and lives, but the Lord does. And I know many of you who are involved in communications work already, how often someone will come up to you and say, you know, you just said just the thing I needed, or that devotion was just perfect, or something like that. And if we really pray for wisdom and insight, the Lord can give us that. And to help us see things that might be confusing, or to understand how people need to learn. So very, very important stuff here. Next, I want to touch briefly on the importance of desktop publishing itself. The thing that is, none of you would be here today if it wasn't for desktop publishing. This is an incredible invention because it makes possible previously impossible projects. When I worked at Young Life in the pre-desktop publishing days, when we would do a ministry brochure, I was usually the publications director, and I was also the writer and editor, and then I would work with artists, and I would work with layout people, and I would work with printers, and we had this whole team, and we would put together maybe 2 or 3 major brochures a year. Now, what happens? Okay, by next week, we need the missions brochure, and we need one for the youth camps, and, you know, all this kind of stuff, and you're expected just to produce it. And desktop publishing allows us to do things that were absolutely impossible. I remember the first time that I actually got to deal with doing my own typesetting. That was an absolute extraordinary miracle for anybody that has in the past had to wait on typeset galleys to be printed out, and then you had to paste them up, and you never got them straight, and they were always crooked, and, you know, all these kinds of things. It just took so much more time. But you have on your desk more power than nations had in the past for communications. You have extraordinary power. The computer that you have also, how many of you, by the way, saw Apollo 13? Did you see that movie? Do Do you know that the computer that each one of you has is more powerful than they had to run the entire space program at that time? You've got that on your desk right now. And it's, when you think about that, you think about the power that you have for sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's really exciting. But you've got that. You can do so much with the programs and the computers that you have. And what's the main thing we do with it? We work to make the intangible touchable. You are in the whole heritage of, as the Bible talks about, when Jesus came to earth, it says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Each of your ministries is part of God's Word to our world. And in what you're doing, you make that flesh. That's really exciting, isn't it? You take a program, say you've got a Mother's Morning Out that really reaches out to your community. You do a brochure that explains it and tells the time and tells people how to get there. You make something that's intangible. You make it touchable and real and pass-onable. Someone visits your church, and as we said earlier, they see the church bulletin. Maybe in the back you have just a very brief way of sharing the gospel. Just, you even have John 3:16, and you say something to people such as, you know, if you feel like you are away from God, all you have to do is talk to Him. And you reach out to people. Somebody might take that home. Somebody might be wandering through town, and they see that brochure or the bulletin. They pick it up. They take it with them, and might be in a really bad place, and they'll look at that, and they'll get to know the Lord. And I could go on and on and on the ways that you can make ministry something that people can grab a hold of by your publications. Real important. And the neat thing about desktop publishing is it does it in a way that suits people's busy lifestyles. And we'll get into this in some of the other sessions, but I don't need to tell all of you that people today are tremendously busy. Nobody has the time to read anything. Nobody has the time to go over all of the material that they need to. And in desktop publishing, you can structure it in such a way, you can do bullets, you can lay it out graphically, and in the sessions that are coming up, we'll talk about all of these things where you can help people grab a hold of it very easily. Another thing desktop publishing allows you to do is it allows you to tailor publications for specific audiences. Several years ago, American Demographics magazine did an article where they talked about how the key trend of the 90s would be individualization. Everybody, to quote a burger ad, wants it their way. We want our publications to speak to us. We want them tailored specifically to our needs. I was talking to a lady before the seminar started who does a singles newsletter. When I was growing up, and most people can identify with this, my church didn't even have a newsletter. Now, every church has a newsletter, but they don't just have one newsletter. You've got one for the singles, you've got one for the kids, you've got one for the men's ministry, you've got one for the women's ministry, you sometimes have a missionary one, and you just have this huge variety of publications. Desktop publishing allows you to do that. In traditional publishing years ago, there was absolutely no way a church could afford all of those different things. You now have the tools to speak to all of those individual needs. And each one, and this is what's very exciting, every church and every ministry will do it in their own way. You'll all have different voices, different styles that will come out. They'll all be tailored to your specific gifts. It's so much fun for me to see things that my students produce. They'll send them back to me and things like this, and they're all different. And I think, how did they learn that from me? But what they did is they took some basic principles and they applied it to their ministry and to their gifts, and that's a very exciting thing. The next thing that desktop publishing is, and this is kind of a tough one in many ways, it's real servant publication. I tell people it's real foot-washing writing. You have to, some of these details that you have to repeat again and again and again, it gets really boring. Also, it's a kind of publication, you do this wonderful work, and you know what, 99% of the stuff you do, nobody's ever going to know you did it. Now, they'll come after you if you have too many typos, but your name won't be on it. And so often you'll be doing things that and this is actually the goal, you want people to see the message, not the messenger. And desktop publishing is something that we receive our thanks from the Lord primarily. We don't get a whole lot of that. It is, however, very demanding in skills and equipment, and I am so thankful that all of you are here today because of the training that you'll get. Because like I say, it doesn't come with the computer. Now, in equipment, you really need to be able to do good desktop publishing, you really need at least a 486 PC. One thing I find that many churches are lacking in, and if you don't know the answer to this, don't worry about it, ask your computer person at church. You really need, with the new programs, at least 16 megs of RAM. RAM is the working space of your computer, and I find in church after church that people have tremendous problems with their desktop publishing program, and nice church people that they are, they blame it on themselves. Oh, I did something wrong, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm a failure. And all it is, it's a lack of RAM. Most computers are sold with just 4 to 8 megs of RAM. You need at least 16. So be sure you go home and have the computer person at your church check on that, and if you don't have enough, request more of it, because it's really essential for doing adequate desktop publishing. People always ask, well, what software should I get? If you are just using a word processor, it's very difficult to do good desktop publishing. You can do it, but you can't do many of the things that you would like to do. I strongly recommend that you get a true page layout program. Two of my personal favorites are Microsoft Publisher and PageMaker. Microsoft Publisher is more of an entry-level program. It retails for under $100, and it's a real good way to get started. PageMaker is a full-blown, you can do everything with it program. In your resource sheets that are in the book, you have them in your packet in the seminar, there are companies that you can get PageMaker if you are a church organization for under $300. It retails for between $600 and $800, but with that you can do absolutely everything imaginable. And the book also has quite a few more details on equipment that we don't really need to go into here. But don't blame yourself if you don't have adequate equipment. It's not your fault. You need the RAM, you need the good software. Let me say one other thing on that. It's very hard for churches usually to budget that in their regular giving program. I have found church after church has had a lot of success raising money for this kind of equipment by asking for a special offering or approaching a business person as a special project. This seems to work really well because business people understand that you can't do quality publications with inadequate equipment and inadequate RAM. And so doing it as a special giving project rather than out of the general funds has tended to work quite well for many churches that I've worked with. Finally, I just want to say again that to do good desktop publishing, you do need to be a designer, a writer, an editor, and a production coordinator. But although that's very demanding, it's not impossible to do. It's very exciting, it's a lot of fun to do, and that's what we're going to be teaching you today. So in this session, we've talked a little bit about an overview of what we're going to learn, why the publications that you're doing are really important, why your job is important, and just some of the importance of desktop publishing. In upcoming ones, we will talk specifically about some of the tools you need to make this work well. I want to welcome you to session 2 of our seminar on doing good newsletters, bulletins, and all of the above for your church or Christian ministry. In this session, we're going to talk about planning your publications. I have found that this is one area that we often skimp on, and then we run into all kinds of problems because we didn't take time to plan. Now, when I talk about planning publications, this doesn't mean that you sit down and have very lengthy meetings. In fact, I think some of the best publication planning takes place if you set a very short period of time to do it. Okay, we're going to have a meeting, we're going to plan how we want the newsletter to work out in the next 15 minutes. And you just write down some of the first things that come to your mind. So don't think this is going to be really long and involved. First of all, you need to understand when you're planning your publications that different kinds of publications work for different ministries. in what we're going to be talking about, you need to understand that there is no perfect publication. A lot of times people will come to seminars, or they'll read books, or they'll want to learn about desktop publishing, and they think if they just learn this little trick or that little trick, that will make the perfect publication. And then they'll be professional and cool, and everybody will show up and all that kind of thing. Not true. I'm just going to show you, just briefly, some different publications, and all of these are fine, just to give you an idea of some of the things that people do. Here's one that was done for a children's church. They call it the Kids Connection. Isn't that kind of fun how they designed that nameplate? I thought that was very nice. This one is for, by the way, this is the one that the lady that I was talking about in session 1 who came kicking and screaming into her first seminar. This is the national publication. She now writes, edits, lays out, does the whole 9 yards on. But the Friends Voice, this is for the Evangelical Friends International. That's their newsletter. Here is a newsletter that is put out by a library district. Here is a newsletter put out by a youth department. This one is so cool. The Chocolate Chip Chronicle, put out by the Girl Scouts. Now, is that a great name, or is that a great name? Here is one put out by Fuller Seminary for pastors. Here is one put out by Christian Missionary Alliance for older people. And, of course, here's one of mine. Cyber Church Update, and this one updates people on what's going on in technology in the church. Now, I hope you saw just from that brief little panning of all of these examples, they were all different, weren't they? They went to different audiences, they were designed for different purposes, and each one of them, by the way, is a very successful newsletter and works real well with the people that it goes to. But so the reason that I wanted to show you those things is I want you, when you're planning, don't think about a vision of a perfect newsletter. Think about what do your people need, and then how can you use the design tools to meet that need. So, so first of all, you've got to realize that different publications for different ministries. Now, how do you then know what your people want and need? You use a planning guide. Now, here we go. This is what we're going to spend most of our time on in this session. You all have a copy of this planning guide in the resource packet, and there is also this page in the book. Now, we'll just go through it. And how you use this planning guide is you have different things that you're going to come up with, different goals, different ideas, things like that. Then for each of them, you have a graphic or a design or textual way that you translate that into reality. You want an outreach piece. Well, how do you do that? You want something that's for youth. How do you do that? There are all kinds of ways that you take your goals and then you translate them into reality. Now, before we go through this, I want to just cover a couple of other points, and then we will go through the form itself. We're doing publishing as a ministry. This is very different than perhaps why an ad agency would do publishing. Sometimes ad agencies want to shock or to stimulate or to create a certain thought in your mind or to actually be an ad against another group. There's lots and lots of reasons why the secular world does publishing. Your primary goal is always ministry. And this will affect greatly how you design things, and I'll give you some specific examples in a minute, but constantly keep that in mind. Remember, too, that planning isn't just something that you do and you get it planned and you carry it out and that's it. It's always a circular process. You plan something, changes come up, you modify it, you record your time and results. You might have to do it differently the next time, and if you think of it more as a circular process, that'll help you out a lot. And then one of the things that will help you tremendously is to always record your time and results. When people are working on desktop publishing, studies show that you tend to lose all sense of time. And I know many of you have done that. You said, oh, this is going to take me 10 minutes. 3 hours later, you're saying, what in the world happened to my time? And part of it, there are real and valid psychological reasons why that happens. That constant hum, it's like a white noise machine. And it literally sort of lulls us into kind of semi-la-la land while we're working on the thing. Also, we get this immediate feedback of you do something with your mouse or your keyboard and you see a change immediately. And that's very psychologically reinforcing. We all sort of become like Pavlov's dogs when we're sitting there at the computer, you know, more and more. This is great. Let me change this, you know. And we literally get hooked on it. So you have to record your time, and that way you'll know how long projects take you, which will help you more in planning the next time. How often have you said, oh yeah, I can get that thing done by tomorrow afternoon? That's insane. You know it's going to take you 3 days to do it, but we forget those kind of things. So it's so much better if you can look back at your log and say, well, I know from past experience that a project like this takes about 8 hours. Now, if you want to just give me 8 hours all by myself, I can do that. However, if I have to answer the phones, go to the meetings, and get, you know, X, Y, and Z done, I'm not going to be able to do that. So real important for you to be honest with yourself. And those kinds of things, too, make for much greater peace in the body of Christ. It works out real well. Okay, let's go through our planning sheet. Project name, that's pretty easy. Date needed. That little detail right there, if you take time with it, will solve you more problems than you can imagine. So many people have problems with desktop publishing projects in the church because they forget several things. One, they forget postage and the time that it takes to mail things. If you're sending stuff out bulk or third class or you know, one of the budget rates, the post office can take up to 3 weeks to deliver it. Then people also tend to forget, how did it get in the mail? Oftentimes with churches and Christian ministries, volunteers prepare the mailing. They come in once a week. Guaranteed that once a week will always be, they will come in the day just before you get the project finished. I mean, that you can just count on it. That's always what happens. Then people forget that it takes time to have something printed, which at a minimum you can usually figure about a week. So if you count average scenario, 2 to 3 weeks for mailing, a week to get the mailing prepared, a week at the printers, you can't even think about doing anything that you've got to mail out if you've got less than a month to work on it. And we forget those kind of things. We just somehow think that when we get it done, when we get it off the computer, then somehow magically people are going to get it in their hands the next week. So be very realistic about that. And you know, just thinking through, you know, and what decisions have to be made before you can even start on certain things. Scheduling the time is real important, and it will allow you to do your design work with much more peace and quiet. Okay, next, production considerations. Some folks do all of their work in-house. Some people have what's called a risograph printer, where they can do actually all of their printing in-house. Some people do things off of their laser printer. Some people work with a printer who maybe volunteers their time, doesn't charge them as much, but has to slot in with a schedule. All kinds of things you need to decide ahead of time. Budget is real important, but it's not as important as some people realize. By doing good design, sometimes you can take a very simple project and make it look very expensive. Another thing, and we'll talk about this in one of the later sessions, if you have a choice oftentimes between using a second color and a more expensive paper, I always recommend that you use the more expensive paper. You can do wonderful things with shading and with clip art and with good use of type, and they'll look fantastic. And a second color can kind of, it doesn't add a whole lot if you have to use really crummy, you know, fluorescent pink paper. Nothing's going to look real great on that. I mean, it just isn't, you know, or the stuff around the church office lately. So you can modify your budget in different ways. Now, those are all pretty standard, but here's where it starts getting tricky. When you're planning, you need to sit everybody down, and you need to ask folks, and you need your leadership always involved in this, and ask them, why are we doing this piece? And this is where it gets very interesting, because so often we will say things like, we're doing this piece to reach out to the community. We're doing this piece for ministry. And that sounds great, but then what so often happens is, why is it that we just talk about ourselves in it? Or why is it that if we're wanting to reach out to people, do we just talk about how great we are? Or why is it if we really want to reach out to people, we don't have real clear schedules and timetables and calendars that are easy for people to read? Another thing too, oftentimes people will be doing ministry publications because they need to raise money. And what I oftentimes ask folks in my seminars is I ask them, how many of you know when all of your magazine subscriptions are due? and always one or two compulsive people raises their hand, but most of us don't know. Or I'll say, do you know the exact day that your utility bill is due and your phone bill is due and all these kinds of things, and people just go, no. And why is it that we don't know that? It's because they always send us a reminder and they ask us for the money. That is how everybody is programmed today. But so often when we're doing things in the church, we think, oh, if we just tell them how nice we are, then they'll send us money. Doesn't work that way. If you're doing a piece to raise money, or you need money for a project, whether it's just enough for scholarships for kids at camp, to raising money for your building fund, you have got to be very specific with people. You have got to tell them why you need the money, what it's going to be used for, how they're going to send it in. And you see, by deciding this is an extremely important design decision. Because unless you know exactly what you want to accomplish, are you going to put in a return card? How are you going to structure the different sections that you have? If you really want to do, say, a church bulletin that welcomes visitors, do you ever say welcome in it? A lot of times people don't. Or they'll say welcome down at the bottom, kind of bottom back page. It'll say something like, and if you're new, we have the nursery here, and the this is there, and that's the other. Nobody ever gets to it. So ask yourself very brutally, why are we doing this? Then, what is the goal that we want to accomplish? Is it something that we can count, measure, that kind of thing? If we want people to sign up for an upcoming project, do you give them a sign-up form? I was talking to a lady recently, bless her heart, she was involved in this great outreach ministry, and she was wanting to get a bunch of people involved in it, and she was going to have a training session for it. And I said, well, how are you going to get them there? Oh, we're just, we're so excited about this, and we're just telling people. I said, are you doing a flyer and a sign-up sheet? And she said, no. And I said, people today are so busy. If you don't give them those tangible, touchable things that they can stick on their refrigerator and pull down when needed, don't expect them to show up. We can't carry all of this information around in our heads. So when you want people to show up for things, be sure you have an actual tangible goal to accomplish. Be sure that you have a tangible thing that you give them to accomplish with it. Then you want to ask, who is your audience? And where are they physically, emotionally, and spiritually? Very, very important stuff. One of the things we have talked about is that people today are tremendously busy. Another little illustration on this that I think you can probably all identify with is many of you have taken time management classes. And what do they tell you in time management classes? They say, just skim over material, look at the subheads, look at the headlines, look at the box material, just skim the captions and get on with it. We all know that. But something funny happens in our heads when we sit down to write up our own things. We assume everybody is going to read every single word that we wrote. Now, in the session where we talk about writing, I'll teach you some ways to get around that. But you've got to remember, everybody is just as busy as you are. And I always tell folks in your church bulletins and in your church newsletters, one of the key ways that you, to test whether it's really going to get its message across to people or not, is you have got to be able to read the thing stuck to a refrigerator when a mother is flying by at 20 miles an hour. If you can't read it then, your message is not going to get across. Because people aren't going to look in the fine print to see what was the time that they were supposed to show up for something. And one of the worst things at all, don't you dare say in any of your publications, call the church office for more information. That's not kind to the church secretary, and she can't be responsible for keeping track of everything in the world. You've got to have it all right there. So you've got to think, where are your people? Now, where are they emotionally and spiritually? It's usually pretty fair to say that folks today are hurting. Our society has just a lot of sad things going on. And in our publications, if we really want to minister to people, we've got to keep that in mind. I worked on a project when I was doing freelancing in the secular world for consumer credit counseling. And this was a real fun project. I see them advertised on the television here, but for those of you that aren't familiar with them, they help people who have gotten themselves massively in debt. And they work out creditors' repayment programs, and they're just really a very, very helpful organization. Well, it's one of those things that's almost too good to be true. How do you tell people about it? They always suspect that they charge a lot of money or things like that, and they don't do that. So they called me in and they said, nobody's picking up our brochures. What's wrong? And I said, well, show me one of them, and tell me how you distribute them to people. You know, just looking at this, where are people, this kind of thing. And they showed me a brochure, and it literally said on it, free help for people with debt problems. Now, who is going to pick that up? It labels you as a person with a problem just by picking it up. Second thing is, where did they distribute it? They distributed it in banks. You go up to your bank, you write this check, you don't know if it's going to bounce or not. And, you know, you see this brochure, free help for people with debt problems, and you think, if I pick that up, then they're not going, you know. I mean, nobody was picking them up because they didn't think, where are the people? And so I said, you know, you've definitely got a problem here. So we brainstormed on ideas for a different cover, and what they came up with, it was just wonderful. And this wasn't my idea, but when I heard it, I said, boy, take that one. Their new cover said, do you know someone whose bills are bigger than their paycheck? Isn't that kinder? Anybody can pick that up. Oh, I'm getting this for Cousin Jane. She's really, you know, whatever. Or Uncle Joe, he's got all kinds of problems with money, so, you know, I'll get this one for him. And it was tremendously successful. And then not only did we do that, that was on the cover. But then as you open it up, I said, well, what are people afraid of? Let's deal with their fears first. And they said, oh, we're afraid that people will yell at them. They're afraid that we'll publish their finances in the paper, you know, all kinds of things. And so as you opened up the cover, then it answered questions. It just had quotes from their clients. One of them said, for example, I can still remember this. This person said, we live beyond our means. Then my wife got cancer. But with the help of consumer credit counseling, we know we're not alone. And another quote said, these people really become your friends. They don't tell anybody how you're spending your money, and they really help you. And you see, we were very kind to people as we welcomed them into the program. Then we answered their fears, and it wasn't until you opened up the brochure that you got the nuts and bolts. This is where they have the orientation classes. This is how you get there, and those kinds of things. And so you see how you can apply that to ministry, where you're really thinking, you know, where are people? How are they going to take in this information? A couple of other examples. You need to think literally where people are physically. This one newsletter that I showed you, on the one for older people, this is a marvelous thing. Christian Missionary Alliance realizes that people, when they retire today, are simply starting a new phase of life. Many people in retirement are tremendously vital, active, and healthy people, and so they have an entire volunteer program for retired people. They also realize, however, that retired people are not into reading 9-point print closely scrunched together. And you can see how the printing is so much larger in this newsletter, even from where all of you are sitting. And they have thought very carefully, physically, where are people? I was working with someone who was doing a church cookbook. And I mean, wonderful things in it and all this sort of thing. But they said to me, they said, you know, people, once they look at it, they really like it, but nobody wants to buy it. And I said, well, show me a copy of it. They brought it into me, and it was this adorable little tiny book with little tiny printing. Now, why do you think people didn't get it? Because I said, and it was a gentleman that put this together, I said, how do people use a cookbook? And he just went, oh. Because we use a cookbook at arm's length, usually sitting on a counter, and you're not going to read little bitty printing. Great contents, he just didn't think how people were going to use it. One more example, and before I get to this other example, you can apply that in so many areas. Are you producing things for children? Are you producing something for a teacher? Again, on schedules, one of the things that I tell people, quite honestly, and I refer to this a lot, but the refrigerator really has become the communication center of many families. But what I sometimes see people doing is they'll put together this great calendar, but then they will have all the phone numbers and contact information where? On the back. Now, what happens when you want to call somebody? You're not going to take it down. And I have seen ministries, seriously, and nobody needs to raise their hand. I see people going, oh boy, you know, that's going to happen a lot in the course of these seminars. So nobody feel, I absolve you all of guilt right now for anything that you're doing that that you'll find out that you shouldn't be doing. But I have seen so many ministries greatly increase their attendance of things if they just say, instead of using an 8.5 by 11, they have an 11 by 17 insert or 11 by 14 insert. They put their calendar here. They have all of the phone numbers right on the front there in real big letters of who to call, where to sign up, even the address of the church. I worked with one church that sent out all of its publications from its church office. Problem was, the church office wasn't where the church was located. Caused people a lot of grief. And so, you know, all of those details right there along with the calendar where people can see it. Because people aren't going to remember. You know that it's on the back. They don't. So very important. One more example of a brochure that worked for folks. This one was something that the Samaritan Counseling Center did in Colorado Springs. And the lady that worked for them was taking my seminars and heard the example that I gave you on consumer credit counseling. Now, they put out a brochure that advertised Christian counseling services. The counseling agencies, Christian counseling agencies there in town were supported by a number of the churches, and people could get greatly reduced counseling. The brochure said on it, free counseling help, supported by Colorado Springs area churches. They put them in the literature holders in the vestibules of churches. Now, imagine this scenario. You just found out your 16-year-old's taking drugs, and your husband's real mad at you anyway. And, you know, all this kind of stuff's going on. You got to go to church Sunday morning, teach a Sunday school class. You know, and you're trying to hold it together and look like a good family. You come out of the church thing, you go by there and you see that brochure and you go, oh man, I'd like to pick that thing up. Are you going to pick up that brochure? No way. Because, I mean, as much as we wish this wouldn't happen, but we know if we pick that up, people will go, oh, you know, she and Joe are fighting again. People aren't just going to, they're not going to pick it up. So, and nobody was. And the counseling center just wasn't going anywhere. Well, after taking the seminar, this is what Jan came up with. And notice this is not a fancy, exotic brochure. When someone you know is hurting, the Samaritan Counseling Center is there to help. You can see how she got that idea, didn't you? And it's great because after they printed this brochure, and very, very simple. I mean, this is the kind of thing any church office could put out. After they printed up this brochure, the marvelous ending of the story is that people picked up more of these in the first 3 months they were put out than in over a year that they had had the previous brochure. So you see, by doing some careful planning, by thinking ministry first and then taking those ministry objectives and then translating that into how you actually work out your design, your layout, your message, that's how you do a powerful publication that will minister to people. So that's our session 2, and in the next one we'll talk about topography. I want to welcome you to session 3 of our seminars on using your computer to create bulletins, newsletters, and all sorts of wonderful things for your church or ministry. This is one of my favorite sessions. This is on topography. This is where you will learn how to set type beautifully and do wonderful things with it. Now, topography is one of the most difficult areas in desktop publishing, and one of the areas that will really set apart your publications and make them look professional if you do it right. What you probably didn't realize when you got that desktop publishing or word processing package is all of a sudden you were thrown into a world that in the past people had to work for many years as an apprentice before they were allowed to do it. People would learn how to set type and how to pour hot lead and how to do all kinds of incredibly complex things. And now all of a sudden you're just supposed to know everything about it and supposed to know how to do it all. And a lot of times people aren't satisfied with how their publications look because the topography isn't right. Whether you know it or not, you all have a fantastic graphic arts education. You've looked at good publications all your life. You've looked at good magazines and newspapers, and you know when something that you do, it just doesn't look right. And it's frustrating to you. And usually it's because of how the type's been set, but you didn't know that. So in this 20 minutes or so that we have, I'm going to totally revolutionize how you look at type. First first of all, when you are working with type, you need to learn how to measure it correctly. This is a pica ruler. Now, what a pica ruler does is it measures things the way typesetters measure things. And the way they measure things, and we're going to be using the flip chart over here and illustrating some things on this, is you normally have where you measure in, say this was an inch. And the thing that is so frustrating about inches is inches are broken up into fractions. You have 1/4 and 3/8 and all this kind of stuff and dreadful things like that. What a pica ruler does is it takes each inch and it breaks it into 6 picas. And that's how you measure things in Topography, and it's the best way to measure things in desktop publishing. All of your desktop publishing programs, you can change the measurements to picas. And so instead of 1/4 and 2/3 and funny fractions like that, you have 1 pica, 2 picas, 3 picas, much simpler to do. Picas then are broken, and it's spelled P-I-C-A. Picas then are broken down into points. And you have 12 points for each pica. Now this term is probably a little bit more familiar to many of you, where you have heard type described as 12 point, 10 point, that sort of thing. So one would assume, wouldn't you, that if type is, say, 72 points high, which would make up, there were 72 points to an inch, that type would be 1 inch high, right? Wrong. Doesn't hardly have anything to do with it. And I'll tell you why. And this is one of the most important things for you to understand in understanding topography. Because even though everything is done electronically today, we use all the same terms and ways of measuring and everything just as if it was still either cut out of wood or poured into metal. And this measurement is one of them, because the 12-point measurement is not the type itself. It is the measurement of the imaginary block around the type. Even though that doesn't exist anymore, you might have your little letter down here. And this might be a 12-point letter, but it doesn't refer to the size of the letter, it refers to the size of the block. Now where this gets tricky is this, for example, might be a lowercase a in times, which is on many of your desktop publishing systems, and it only takes up that amount of space on the block. What happens then when you get to a 12-point A in lithos that looks like that? Those are both 12-point letters, but you see how they take up tremendously different amounts of space. And it's very confusing because on your desktop publishing programs they will tell you, oh, you can just change the typeface real easily. Yeah, you can, but it's going to be doing very different things to how your type looks, how much space it takes up, that sort of thing. What I recommend that you do is you come up with, say, a basic sentence, maybe, say, John 3:16. Type that up on your computer and then change the type and do it in different typefaces. And that will give you a sample of, okay, I know Times takes up this much space, Helvetica takes up this much, Lithos takes up this much, and it'll really give you more of a sense of how the different typefaces look. In a minute, I'll go over some of the basic ones and what you might want to use them for, but you need to know that as on the early just measurements and that kind of thing. What we're going over now is we're going over our measurements and terms, first of all in our letter forms and in our sizes. Now that's the first thing that you need to learn. The second one is you need to learn not only how the letter forms are sized, but the sizing between the spaces. Now this is very interesting because when Gutenberg first set type, first inventor of the printing press, he went along and he set a block of type, that sort of thing, and then he put another one right by it, right underneath it. And any of you that have seen some of the early copies of some of the early books, you know they look like the lines are really close next to each other. It looks like it's hard to read because the lines are sort of jammed together, but that was how he started out doing it. And he just set the blocks of type one on top of each other. And the term that's used actually in typesetting is called set solid. Well, they realized that after looking at that it was hard to read. After looking at how the manuscripts were written where more space was, they realized that people's eye needed a line of white space from the end of one line to track back to the start of the next line. So, well, how are they going to do it? What they did is they inserted thin strips of lead in between one block, the lead, and then the next block of type. And of course, that's where we get the term leading. It looks like leading, but it isn't. It's pronounced leading. So now you all know you can be very sophisticated. And you see that in your desktop publishing book and someone calls it leading, you can say, no, 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 it's leading, not leading. Now, we use the same term, and we measure it exactly the same way the topographers did. You've got a 10-point block of type here, and say you've got 2 points of lead. That makes a total of 12 points between here and down here. You've got a 10-point block of type, but it's actually sitting on 12 spaces. And that is designated 10 on 12. In all of the desktop publishing books, typesetting books, you see these fraction-looking things, but they aren't really fractions. And when I first started, I thought, 10 twelfths, what in the world is that talking about? It isn't. It's pronounced 10 on 12. And that's how you figure out leading. Now, one of the pieces of good news is that this is usually figured out for you automatically in your desktop publishing programs. Let me show you some actual samples of it. Here are some leading samples. And this first one is, and this is what's, by the way, this is called dummy text. This is the Lorem Ipsum, and it's just dummy text. It doesn't mean anything, but you see that used a lot to just show how type lines up. Here we have times 12 on 12, or set solid. And see how even though you can't read it, it looks hard to read? Then over here is times set 12 on 14, or in your desktop publishing programs, what's called the auto leading. And again, you see how even though you can't read the words, it just looks easier to read. Be very careful that when you're trying to cram in more words or get more text in, that you don't switch from auto leading to setting solid just because you can do it. A lot of times we'll do kind of crazy things, but we make it much, much harder for people. And always on your text, go ahead and trust your auto leading and you'll be just fine. Now, where you do need to change it, and this is one of the things that sets apart a professional typesetter from someone who perhaps doesn't know quite what they're doing as well, is because your programs are set automatically to increase the leading as you increase the size. Remember those blocks, how there was a lot of white space around it? As the blocks get bigger, there's more white space in between all of the letters, and it just pushes things farther and farther apart. So, when you get to your headlines, if you use auto leading, they'll be too far apart. And you'll see this on a lot of newsletters where people didn't know they weren't supposed to do any better. Their headlines are spread out way too far apart. If you look at something like USA Today or any of the newspapers, you'll notice the headlines are really close together. And so on your headlines, anything above about 18 to 20 points in type, you want to set them solid. And you only start moving them apart if the letters touch each other. But just as a general rule, with your headlines, set them solid, and they'll look much, much better. Will look much more professional. Now, the next thing after people learn some of the basics on type, folks always ask then, what typefaces should I use? It's very tempting to use all sorts of different typefaces. And it's rather interesting, whenever changes come in technology that makes a lot of typefaces available to people, everybody wants to use them all. And where we last saw this in the whole printing world is in the days of the Wild West. For some reason, there was a big explosion of how they were able to print typefaces. And so you see all those Western brochures that have all kinds of different typefaces in it. Don't they look just like modern-day desktop publishing? People get all these typefaces on some of these CD-ROMs now that are, 3 million typefaces for $15 and feel like they have to use them. My advice to you is don't do that. You must restrain yourselves. When you are doing the majority of your work, which will tend to be text-based projects, you want to stick with a very simple selection of typefaces. Now, in running text, and by the way, these may not have exactly the same names. Typefaces, it's very interesting. They are designed by type designers, and they're just like designer dresses. Someone will come up with a new typeface, they will cut the design, and it will have a licensed name that goes with the typeface. Then other type companies, because they can't copy it exactly, will change it just a little bit, and they will go from, say, the designer dress to the upscale department store dress to the Kmart version. And they'll have to change the name as they go along, and it'll look similar, but it won't quite be the same. Times has been copied and copied and copied. It's been called Times, and then they call it Times New Roman, and then some places call it Dutch, and there's just all kinds of different names for the different typefaces, but it's one of the most popular, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. But the big distinction between text typefaces, and you want to stick with very simple typefaces. Don't use any of those fancy, exotic things for running text because they're much harder to read. You want to look at a typeface that either looks like Helvetica or looks like Times. Now, Times is what is called a serifed typeface. That's those little bitty feet that you see sticking out of the edges of the letter, and that's considered a good thing to use in running text because the serifs kind of carry your eye along. It's interesting, the history of serifs. We weren't around when somebody actually first designed them, but there are two theories on them, and both of which make a lot of sense to me. All of the early Roman inscriptions were serifed typefaces, the early Roman letters, and they have thought that probably they needed a way to actually bring the chisel out of the stone. You don't just cut and have a nice squared off corner. That was the way the chisel came out of the stone. The next, of course, big innovation in communication was when people started writing, and as any of you know who have done calligraphy, you don't just do a letter and end it. You need a way to bring the pen or whatever you're writing with off of the paper. And again, all the medieval manuscripts, they're all serifed because they needed a way to bring their pen off of the paper. And so we don't know whether it's just this is what people are used to seeing or whether it is actually easier for people to read it that way. But your serif type tends to be a real winner for readability. Now, Times, let me say just a little bit about this particular typeface. It's a very interesting one. It was cut for the Times of London newspaper around the turn of the century. It was designed to be a typeface that you could get lots of words in a limited amount of space. It was designed to be very readable, and it was designed to reproduce well under adverse printing conditions. Now, doesn't that sound exactly like desktop publishing today? And it's no accident that this typeface is the typeface that has been bundled with every single desktop publishing program that's been sold from the earliest days. And it's one that you can't go wrong with. I mean, if in doubt, use Times, and you'll be just fine. In your packet of examples, in my newsletter here on desktop publishing and new media in ministry, this entire newsletter, it's done in Times. People think, oh, you can't get a whole lot of variety, but you can, and I'll be talking about styles in a minute, but some things you make bold, and some things you make Roman, and some things you italicize, and you do things in different sizes, and whatever. But it's a very, very useful typeface, and you can just use it for anything imaginable. The other typeface is Helvetica. Helvetica is a sans serif typeface. That just means without the serifs. And all of your sans serif faces are much more modern. They're much more contemporary. A traditional way to do your publications is to use a sans serif face for headers and then a serif face for text. But you can actually use one or the other if it's a good typeface throughout. Like I said, and this one just makes it a whole lot easier, and I think it gives a nice consistent look. I've just used one throughout. But those are two real good ones. Now, in addition to your type that you use for running text, you also have what's called display type. Now, these are all those wild and crazy and fun typefaces that you can use for lots of other things. Don't use them, though, in your regular day-to-day publications. Save them for things like the nameplates of newsletters. Any typeface goes, though, I say, when you're working for the junior high department. If you have this urge to be incredibly creative and do wild and crazy things, volunteer to do publications for the youth department. Anything goes for them. But machine is one that's real popular. On one of the other newsletters that you have an example of, my Cyber Church Update, this is machine. And you see how it works out real well as a strong, bold typeface for a nameplate. Works great for that. This would not make a nice kids connection typeface. You know, I mean, it wouldn't work for that. But for something like this, a technological thing, it works. Another one is Parisienne, and again, there are different things that have lots of different names. Parisienne is one that you see used in menus a lot. For some reason, it's very popular that way. And there are lots of, and there are very distinctly, too, typefaces that look masculine and typefaces that look feminine. And you want to, as we said earlier, there is no perfect way to do any one publication. Some things you want to gear to one audience, and typefaces really have a personality. And you just look at it and you say, you know, does that typeface look like the audience that I'm slanting it towards, and then you want to use it. Then there are lots of fun typefaces. Adobe Systems comes up with some real neat ones. This one's called Critter, and this they have a collection that's called their Wild Type. It's available in all of the mail order publications, and it's only something like $39 for about 8 typefaces that are very creative. Critter's one of them. Toolbox is great, all these tools. Giddy Up. My husband and I used this one when we were sponsoring a day up in the mountains for the singles group that we were working with in Colorado. We did the whole brochure in Giddy Up and did some fun things with it. So you can use your display faces for advertisements, for things for the youth, for nameplates, for that kind of thing. But don't be tempted to use them in running text. It makes it real hard to read. The last one that I want to comment on here are your script typefaces. The one that is used most frequently is one that's called Zaff Chancery. Now, it's interesting to me how people innately know a lot of things about design, even though they didn't realize that they knew that. And one of the design principles, and we will be talking about this in another session, is that you want to have contrast in your publications. And there are different ways to do that. Unfortunately, one of the ways a lot of people get contrast is they know, say they want to have the running text in this, they want contrast, and they'll use Zaff Chancery for their headers and for headlines in newsletters and bulletins and that sort of thing. That's really an improper use of that typeface. This typeface was designed to be used in things that you would be printing that would emulate engraved classical printing, things like invitations, announcements, that sort of thing. And it was never intended to be used in all caps. These are what are called decorative caps at the start of the Zaff Chancery alphabet. And when you use them in all caps, they'll run into each other, and they'll really look funny. And I see that a lot in different publications. It's just kind of one of those innate things. People say, oh, I need something different, so I'll use this. And they've got the principle right, but they've selected an incorrect typeface. Much better to stick with something like Times and say Helvetica, and then save this for the wedding announcements, for invitations to parties, that kind of thing, where in the past you would have taken it to be engraved. That's the proper use of this typeface. It's also highly inappropriate for business cards. And people look at it, and it's sort of at cross purposes. People will think, oh, I want something that's pretty. Yeah, it's pretty, but it doesn't portray a professional image. Typefaces all have underlying images, and so you want to avoid that in those settings. Now, in addition to typefaces, you have a whole additional palette that you can work with in using type, and that's what's called your type styles. Now, most of us learned how to communicate using the typewriter, and when we just had the typewriter, we were pretty limited on how we could get across our message. We did some things that you want to unlearn, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But you've now got this whole brand new tool known as your type styles and your weights. These are things like your italic, your bold, that sort of thing. Now, the way you want to think about them and the way you'll know how to use them is think of your type styles as tone of voice. When I'm just talking in a normal tone of voice, and it's called, in your styles, sometimes normal, or it's called Roman. That's just a normal speaking voice. The reason it's called Roman is all of the Roman letters, there was no such thing as italic or bold in any of the Roman engravings. They just had one straight thing, and it was always straight up and down. Now, the way type is specified, and the way that you will see it specified in type books and in descriptions, is you will have the name of the typeface, such as Times, and then there'll be a comma, and then you have the style. In this case, we'd have Times Roman. Sometimes it's spelled with a little r, or Times Normal. And I know when I was first doing desktop publishing, I thought it was Times Roman. It isn't. It's Times is a typeface, Roman is a style. Then you can also have Times and then Italic, or Times Bold. And you always have your name first, your style second. So Times Roman or Times Normal, that's just as if I was speaking in a normal tone of voice. Then you get to Italic. Now, it's rather interesting how Italic was invented. Italic was invented by Aldus Manutius in the 15th century, where the man who they first named Aldus PageMaker after. And he actually invented it because he was one of the first publishers to print popular novels. He printed these really pretty little bitty books, and he wanted to be able to cram more type into one page, and so he was the inventor of italic type, because when he cut it and slanted it, he found that he could get more letters more closely packed together. Well, italic soon went out of favor as something to do in books because it is harder to read. But I'm going to say something, and I want you to tell me how the word would look. If I say, John, I'd like you to come into the house, and would you please put away your clothes? How would that word please be typeset? Be italicized, wouldn't it? You can just almost see it, please. So think of italics as soft emphasis. It was rather interesting. I was working with a lady that I work with on doing a newsletter recently, and she, and we'll talk about this later, she had made some subheads really big and bold, and they really stood out. And I said, you know, it's too harsh for this particular story. It was a journal of a lady who was adopting a little girl from Cambodia. I said, let's italicize the first line of those paragraphs instead of making it bold, and just make it a very soft emphasis. And it really worked well. That did a good job. So whenever you want soft emphasis, think italics. Okay, if that's soft emphasis, then it's not too hard to imagine what bold is. John, stop that! Didn't you just see those words jump up? They suddenly become bold. And so think of bold. The bold style is when you want to say something louder. And the louder you want to say it, the bigger you want it to be. And that's how you'll know when to use bold. Now then, of course, this is a trick question. What is outline then? Well, that is nothing. We don't hear anything in our heads when we see something outlined. And that's why things like outline and shadow and some of those more, you might say, contrived effects are useful, again, for advertisements, for artsy kind of things, for flyers and that sort of thing. But don't use them in running text because our mind visually can't associate them with anything. And so you want to be real careful in your use of them. It's kind of funny. I wish in desktop publishing that they had a little icon that would pop up if you use something incorrectly. I mean, wouldn't it be great, you know, if it said, this is real ugly, don't do it. I refuse to print this. But it won't. The system will allow you to publicly embarrass yourself. So that's why you're all listening to this video. So anyway, be real careful when you use things like outline and shadow. And you know, I don't see them used nearly as much as I used to. When desktop publishing first came out and people had access to them, it was like, oh, wow, this is really fun, you know, put this in whatever. And people don't use that quite as much anymore. Okay, now this next one will change your life radically and forever. The 5 commandments of desktop publishing. Now, you have this printed out on a separate sheet. You have my permission to use this to guilt trip whoever you want to and take it back and pass it around or whatever. Let me just go ahead and read this, and then we'll go over each of the different things. New way of doing things require new guidelines. Just like when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, they needed a whole new way to live. So too, when you come out of the wilderness of typewriter land, you need a new set of guidelines for the promised land of desktop publishing. We all learn to type a certain way. Unfortunately, how people type is totally different than how you typeset. And this is one of the things that will greatly distinguish between what is very professional looking work and something where you can say, oh, they didn't really quite know exactly what they were doing. Now, if all of you had attended topographer's apprenticeship, you would know these sorts of things. But since you didn't, you're now attending it right here. The rules are, number one, the commandments are, thou shalt use one space, not two, after periods and other punctuation. You will need to, for a month, tie your little fingers together. It's so hard to unlearn that one, but it's very important. And I'm going to illustrate why here. In typewriter publishing or whatever, the typefaces that you use on the typewriter are what are called monospaced. For example, if we have the word trial, T-R-I-A-L, it would all be, each letter takes up the same amount of space no matter how wide the letter actually is. You know, on your typewriter, your Piker, your Elite, I mean, they all take the same amount of space. It's different, though, with typesetting. When you would type up something like, say you're using the Typeface Times or Helvetica, either one, you have the T-R-I-A-L, and each letter takes up just the amount of space that's needed for that particular letter. Because it takes up so much more in typewriting, you need the two spaces to clearly see when another sentence starts. That's why you have to have the two spaces in monospaced type. In typeset type, it's already so much closer together, and if you do two spaces, it looks like a really big gap. And I warn you, now that I've told you this, and you looked at the example there, you will never look at another piece of desktop publishing the same again. You'll be able to pick it out immediately, and it will just look so awkward, those additional spaces. Now, the only time that you don't do that is when you use one of the monospaced fonts. Every now and then, you will want to do something in your desktop publishing work where you use a typeface such as Courier or American Typewriter, where it actually, you want it to still look like it was done by a typewriter. And then you can go ahead and do that. But 99.9% of the time, only that one space. Now, let me just say briefly why you might want to use a typeface like Courier or American Typewriter. We all have a type vocabulary in our heads that we didn't even realize that we had. And where this comes from, early on when they were putting together magazines, the magazine would be typeset, and as many of you know, and as I said earlier, the typesetter would typeset it and they would paste up the pages and long, laborious process and all that. Well, sometimes if it was, say, a news publication, they would literally have late-breaking news that the editor would type up on the typewriter. You would have these typewritten pages, and they would be reproduced and usually bound into the center at the last minute. Many of us grew up with publications that were like that, or we've seen ones that are like that. And so what does typewritten type say to us? It says, this is immediate, this is up to date, this is a late-breaking news. And so a lot of companies now, they'll have a late-breaking news where they'll use that typeface. It's typeset just like everything else electronically today, but it just says something different to us in our mental vocabulary, and that's perfectly acceptable to do. Number two, thou shalt use true quote marks and apostrophes. Again, on the typewriter, all we had were the feet and inches marks. But in typesetting, the straight up and down things mean feet and inches. The curved ones are the true quotation and apostrophes. So if you want, again, to look very professional, you need to do that. Many of the programs today have a setting where you can check, it'll say something like use topographer's quotes. And you can check that at the start of your document and you'll be fine. In some of the older programs, you have to look up in your manual, and it's a key command each time that you have to change. That's a giant pain in the neck, but unless you want to have feet and inches signs in inappropriate places, you need to do that. Thou shalt use a proper long dash. It's called actually an M dash instead of two dotted hyphens when you want a true dash. Now, again, when you had the typewriter, that was the only way that you could distinguish a dash from a hyphen. Now, it's always a key command, and it's different with the different programs, but you want the solid line. You see those two dotted ones, and you'll be able to say, not very professional. Now, this next one, thou shalt not use all capital letters in headlines or sections of text. I'm going to stand in front of the board briefly and write something on it, and then I'll illustrate why this is so important. Okay. Is that the same word? It isn't, is it? Okay, but it's always interesting when I ask people that because it takes people a minute to answer because you have to look up and down to double check. This is a very important principle for you to understand because we learn to read by reading the shapes of letters, of words, excuse me. And you can see when the two words are in lowercase, it's very easily to say string and spring. But when they're all capital letters, the shape is exactly the same. And so your mind has to stop and go back and say to itself, S-T-R-I-N-G, S-P-R-I-N-G. We're not even conscious that we do it, but it takes longer to read. When you only had the typewriter, that was all you were able to do was to use all caps to emphasize things. Now you have many other tools, the most important one being, of course, bold. I tell people now you'll automatically want to do all caps. Instead, do it upper and lowercase and make it bold. It accomplishes the same purpose, and it's much, much easier to read. The next rule, and the final one, thou shalt not underline in place of using italics. This is a lot for the same reasons. Underlining cuts off the descenders, the lower parts of the letters, and it makes them harder to read. Again, when you only had the typewriter, that was the way we said to people, this is italics. Now you have a way to do true italics when you want to softly emphasize things or when you want to set apart something as the title of a book or that kind of thing. So you use true italics. But if you keep these guidelines in mind and you follow them, your typography will be much, much more professional looking. You'll be happier with it, and you'll have really polished publications. That's all for this session, and then in the next one we're going to talk about how to do writing. Welcome to session 4 of our seminar on how to do bulletins, newsletters, and all sorts of wonderful other publications on your computer for your church or ministry. Now this session, I have to admit, is one of my very favorites. This is on writing to reach today's audiences. I have been teaching writing in one form or another for the last over 20 years, and so it's been very interesting to me to see how the teaching of writing and how we take in information has changed so much. Let me show you an example that will illustrate this. Now, I don't go back quite this long, but I was working on a project with the Colorado Springs Pikes Peak Library District. And in doing that, they gave me one of the facsimile newspapers of that time. I was helping them do a historical thing for the library. Notice how this is typeset. Would any of us take time to read this today? The solid text. We just don't, do we? We look at that and we say, boy, that's got to be a really old thing, isn't it? And what's very interesting is today we want our information in sound bites. We want it in the little chunks. It's sort of give me the information, give it to me quickly, let me get on with my life and that sort of thing. So very, very different how we want things. In the book, I've got a couple of illustrations that I think will help you see the difference in how we used to take in information and how we do it today. Here I have a typical sheet that's some sort of publication put out by someone in the church, solid text. And by the way, this is exactly how my pastor gave me this information. And what happens when you get something like this? It goes into what I call the guilt pile. You don't want to read it right now. You're not going to take time with it, but you don't want to throw it away because you know it's from the church, and so you put it into, well, I'll read this when I get around to doing it. You never do. What's really sad is this, the title of it, Claim My Ministry Now. It is announcing a very important program that the church was putting on. Told you what was expected of you, how you were supposed to respond, all that kind of thing. Down in the bottom of it, nobody would get around to reading it. Took the same thing and ran it through what I call my 3-step plan for publications. And this makes something that is much more readable for people. They look at the photograph. Up at the top it says, Claim Your Ministry Now. Then the subtitle, Claiming My Ministry is a volunteer program at First Church that seeks to enable and encourage every person in the congregation to practice their spiritual gifts. You see, if people only read the headline and that subtitle, at least they know what's going on. Think of how much mental health that would save in the church. Now, let me show you how to work this into practice. We're going to talk in this section about powerful, effective desktop publishing writing. Now, the way you accomplish writing that will reach people today is you need to learn to write in levels. This comes from, I've condensed this down from doing a tremendous amount of study in direct mail marketing and all sorts of other consultations with a lot of professionals in the field, and I've had person after person tell me how well this works for them. And when you apply these principles to your publication, you won't believe how it will change response rates. Now, on writing in levels, first, this takes into consideration that of 100 people who get your publication, and like it or not, a lot of things in the church are probably not eagerly awaited by the people looking, that get them in the mail. It kind of falls into the junk mail category. If you don't let people know immediately that it's for them, that it's going to do something for them, they may or may not even open it at all. And studies show that out of 100 people who get something in the mail, 20% won't even open it. It was great when I was living at a townhouse before I was married, because here were the mailboxes, here was the trash bin, here was my townhouse. I didn't even have to bring half the stuff in. I was able to do sort of that initial sorting on the way home. But that's what we all do. Now, to get around that, of course, many publications don't make you have to open an envelope. If you're doing a ministry publication and you want everybody to read it, one of the best things you can do is a postcard. And the postcard will just have one message on it. Sign your kids up for camp this week. That can be on the outside. You flip it over in great big old letters, sign them up in the church patio, bring $15 registration, fill out the consent form. That's all you've got, that's all you need, and you can go for it. So that will increase rates even more. But say you have something that you want people to read, your newsletters, even your church bulletins, all of it applies onto this. Now, the very most important part of any current publication today is this level 1 right here. Because 80% of your people will read it, and this consists of your headlines, your subheads, and your captions. This is the critical part of your publications, because 80% will read it. And what happens, though, and this is, again, one of those things that people just tend to do just from training and innately in their publications, is instead of writing a true headline that lets people know what's going on, what do we tend to do? We tend to label. For example, and this is a section that in the book will go into much more detail, but we will often have something like pastor's column, notes from Reverend Smith, something like that. Well, what does that say to you? Nothing. It just kind of says, well, we know who wrote it. But let me warn you, though, people get really attached to that little label. What you can do is you take the label and you make it a decorative graphic element. For example, here we have the pastor's column. We've made that reversed. We've put it up above there. And then you write a true headline. For example, here, Church Relief Committee giving aid just hours after hurricane's devastation. Even if you don't read the whole article, you know your church was on hand, it did something, you know what was going on. So often, I find that as I critique publications, that people put really essential information in things like this editorial, the notes from the senior pastor, the notes from the youth director, whatever, but nobody ever knows what's the payoff, so they don't get into it. Keep in mind also, as we've talked again and again, how people's lives are so busy today. You want to construct your headline not just so that people will read the article, but so they get the essential information even if they don't have time to do it. And that's a really hard thing for us to get in our heads. We think if people don't read it, that means they don't like us, they don't care about the ministry, whatever. That's not true. People are just so busy today that you want to enable them to grasp the information real quickly, whether they have time to or not. Headlines, very, very important. This is something that, to be perfectly honest, I struggle with all the time in my own publications, because the last thing we want to do after we've spent all this time writing an article and editing, and we finally get it into the program and it's laid out and all this, is we don't want to take time to write a headline. Headlines are a lot of work. In the major newspapers, such as USA Today, they have whole headline producing departments. That's all they do. They don't write the stories, they don't go out reporting, they don't do anything. They write headlines. This is another thing that all of you get to do. So keep in mind it's very, very difficult. and I struggle with this all the time. For example, in the sample that you have, one of the things that I did in this newsletter is, my headline is, "A Giant Postcard Breaks Advertising Tradition for a Christian Camp." I wanted a way to, even if people don't read the whole article, they know that this camp used a big old postcard to do their advertising. They've gotten one nugget of information that's very helpful to them. Down here, you've already got the skills to master the information superhighway. More and more people in the church are being asked to get online, think about designing a web page, start getting an email list, all that kind of thing. And in this article, I'm reassuring people, you've already got so many of the skills that you need. It's just a new medium. Again, if they don't have time to read the whole thing, they see the headline, they know that. Some of the ways, always when you're looking at the headline, I'm going to give you a really sort of tragic example. Always think, what would people get out of the story if they didn't read the story and all they read is the headline? Now this one right here, how many of you are going to want to read this article?